Lakshmi, thank you so much for being with us on ITV Gold. I hope you're doing well today, and I appreciate you for giving us your time and SALT's perspective on a lot that's happening.
Great. Yes. Thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to talking with you.
Of course. Lakshmi, just starting off this interview, I have to start off asking you about SALT's stand on George Floyd, but not just George Floyd, but just on the entire conversation of what's happening with the African American community. I'd like to discuss what your stand is, what SALT's stand is, and how have you sort of understood the situation as a nonprofit?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. We have been extremely disheartened, of course, about what happened to George Floyd being murdered at the hands of police. And this has been an issue at SALT that we have spoken about in the last several years. It just continues to be part of a cycle of brutality and violence by law enforcement against Black communities in this country. And we believe that at SALT, as non-Black communities of color, it's really important that we understand what's happening here and that we think about our own advocacy around policing, around hate violence, around other issues that impact our community within this context. And we feel like that's very important. We did issue a statement as such, and we will continue to do so and support the efforts to address.
Talking about what has happened, my question to you would be, what do we tell our younger generation and how do we explain the situation to them? They're watching everything, on social media, on news. This entire situation has gone viral. Even Rayshard Brooks' case that just happened this past weekend also has gone super viral because of that. What kind of a conversation should we be having with the younger generation?
Yeah, I think that's so critical. And, as somebody who is a bit older now, I actually feel like I've learned actually so much from the younger generation. In 2015, SALT had a Young Leaders Institute program that was a leadership development cohort that was entirely focused on the theme of confronting anti-Black racism in the South Asian community. And we had 16 young people who are a part of that cohort whose projects we actually hope to share in more detail in the coming weeks. Who did incredible work on addressing anti-Blackness from the perspective of law enforcement, from institutions. Many of them were in college and were addressing that on their campuses, in their community, among other community institutions and religious institutions in the South Asian community. So I actually think that we have a lot to learn from them. And I do know that, all eyes are on this right now. And I think it's really important to continue the conversation, both to rise up to the call from the Black community and from the movement for Black lives to show up now as non-Black people of color, but also to do our work to really examine anti-Blackness within our communities.
Let's talk about this issue of anti-Blackness, Lakshmi, because, this is something that's definitely come up in several conversations in the last few weeks with the case of George Floyd and other cases that have come, consecutively after that. How do you explain this evidence of anti-Blackness in the South Asian American community? And if we were to have a discussion on what that means in a society to have that, and what does that reflect? How would you answer that?
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult conversation. I know that people have struggled to try to have this conversation within their families, and there are organizations like Equality Labs, like the National Queer South Asian Network, and others who have created spaces to have this dialogue and this conversation. SALT was very happy to co-sponsor the In Defense of South Asians in Defense of Black Lives event that Equality Labs, Drum, and many others organized this past weekend. And I think it's important that we have those types of conversations. I think there's a lot of inroads into the conversation. Our partners at Equality Labs have also taught us it's really important, specifically as Indian Americans, to think about caste and colorism and religious discrimination and how those issues are actually at the root of anti-Blackness within our communities. And so I think, I think many of our communities are still trying to figure out what is the entry point for those conversations, because I know many of us have ended up frustrated with relatives and community members and family and others when trying to have these conversations. But I think more and more resources are being developed by many of these organizations who are on the leading edge of these discussions. So I think it's important that we start there.
how important is it for the South Asian American community to be an ally of the Black community right now?
Sorry, Aditi, I think you froze a little bit. Can you
Did
just
I
say that again?
freeze? Yes, I
Yeah, for me,
froze.
yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna like mark this. There was a little freeze in there. I was just asking, how important do you then think it is for us, South Asian American community or other minority community, to be the ally for the Black community right now, to stand in the causes, to be their support and have the discussion?
Yeah, I think it's extremely critical. As people of color and especially as South Asian communities, we have, I think, greatly benefited from the struggles that the Black community has had to wage in this country. Of course, the most notable being the civil rights movement, which I think it's important to remember was also very, very violently repressed by our government. I think there's a lot of talk about wanting to see peaceful protests and all of that as a pathway to change. But I think we have to remember that there was so much violence deployed against Black communities during the civil rights struggle. So I think that's really critical to remember. And then I also think as we as a community also consider our reliance on the police and policing for so many of the issues that we also face in our community, it's important for us to interrogate that and really think about how we're relying on racist institutions.
Just discussing more on that, Lakshmi, I'd like to discuss systemic racism, another huge topic that has come out, in the front for discussion the last couple of weeks, but also its relation to police brutality. What are your comments on it? And then what do you also have to say about the fact that there have been over 1,000 cases since 2015 of police brutality, against African American community? In that sense, how important is it for us to understand that and to also understand the relation between the two?
Yeah, I think it's so great to hear in the mainstream discourse people talking about systemic and institutionalized racism, because I don't think that's really been the case before. A lot of times when these cases happen, it's always seen as, oh, that was one bad cop, there's just a few bad apples in the system. But I think what's really happening now is that the mainstream, which people in the movement have been saying for a very long time, are now realizing that the entire system is corrupt to its core, is rotten to its core. And I think that's a really important lesson that's coming out now. Many years ago in 2013, Malcolm X grassroots movement put out a report detailing how they were able to find that every 28 hours a Black man was killed by a police officer, a security guard, or a self-appointed vigilante. And so I think it's really important that this data is being collected and that we understand the connection between systemic racist institutions, and that policing is one of many of those institutions.
What are your comments on the protests and the outreach that you've seen across the nation? Even, as of today, we're seeing those demonstrations continue for many people. How important do you think it is, that these protests happen in order to advocate the voice? And then when you're discussing that, what are then your comments on the riots and the looting that has happened and the kind of damage that has happened? How should we sort of reflect on all of it put together?
Yeah, I know it's a complicated situation, but I do think that the protests are so critical right now, and I think that people are out in droves right now because the one single demand that they have been making for years, which is to have accountability and recourse when police officers continually murder Black people, has not been met. And that's the one thing that we're not hearing from any of the elected officials who keep, especially from this administration, who want to keep focusing on the rioting and the looting and the protests. It's that there's one demand being made and it continues to not be met. And so I would say, in terms of what is being framed as rioting and looting, I don't think that's a fair characterization of what's happening. I personally, and I think we should all as a country, value human life over property. And I think when the one demand that people have been asking for continues to go unheard, continues to be ignored, there is no choice. There is no choice.
What have you felt about the president's response to the situation, or I would say how the White House has reacted to it? Do you think it's sufficient? Does it need more work in terms of representation?
Yeah, I mean, I think this administration has been abysmal. I don't even know if we can characterize what's come out of them as an actual response. I think that they continue to ignore the issues. I would not say that what they have done would even count as a response. And so I think we need to this. I don't know what the inroad is with this particular administration and even having this conversation. They continue to uphold systems of systemic racism from the beginning, from the Muslim ban all the way to how they've handled COVID, to this long-standing issue around police brutality. And so I'm not sure that having a dialogue with this administration is really a path forward for any of us.
But then what is then needed out of the system, Lakshmi? Is it a legislation change? Is it a change in educating the police of this country, the law enforcement of this country? 50A has been repealed. There are conversations about defunding parts of the police for community policing. There's also conversation about dismantling police in certain areas. According to you, what is the solution to this issue? And when we're looking at this defunding of the police, what does that truly mean?
Yeah, so I think, there has been the Justice and Policing Act of 2020 that was introduced in Congress. And I think, once again, that sort of goes again along the analysis that, there are a few bad cops in the system. And here are ways that we can tweak and reform the system for it to work better for people. And I think that what these demonstrations across the country are showing is that reforms do not work. I think the defund the police strategy is a really important one that the movement for Black Lives has been talking about for a very long time in one of their core pillars, which is to divest in police and to invest in communities. And I think that really is the key. And I worked in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and one of the tools that we used was participatory budgeting. And what that really did was think about look at how much money is being spent on expanding the jail and funding the police state here in New Orleans, which incarcerates more people than anywhere in the US. And what can we do if we really understand the city budget? How can we take the money out of policing and actually invest it in resources for our communities? And that's the conversation that I think is happening at the national level right now around abolition and defunding the police. And I think there are some really I think very well thought out tactics. I think 8 to Abolition is a really powerful campaign that has come out that really lists what are the reforms that we can make that actually lead to defunding and abolishing the police. So I think these are some of the things that we really need to be following.
But this is a change in the core system that we're talking about, right? It's not a one-day change. It's not a small, little, bill that's passed. We're talking about a full reform, if I'm understanding you right.
Yeah, we're talking about a full transformation of the system, and I wouldn't even call it reform, because then that means that there's some legitimacy still left in the system that can be, tweaked or moved to make it better. And I think what people are calling for is like total transformation, and I really think that that's what we need right now.
Lakshmi, there has been a pushback from the other side against these protests in which they're claiming all lives matter. There has been a push for why these protests are happening, why just only Black Lives Matter. I would just like for you to give a response back to that if possible.
Yeah, I think this all lives matter framing is really, really problematic. I think it's really important to understand that the Black Lives Matter hashtag was created, and the campaign and all of the work that went behind it was created to show that all lives, yes, should matter, but they don't. And it's been very clear in this country that Black lives do not matter for so long. And I think that is the whole point of it, is that all lives do not matter. And we have seen that over and over again, that is not how Black communities are treated. And so I think it's important to understand, why that particular campaign emerged and why that language. It's critical that we see that, and to sort of whitewash or brownwash it with this idea of all lives matter as a counter to that narrative is really problematic, and it really erases the reason that campaign was created.
Lakshmi, if I was to ask you, because a lot of our viewers are South Asians watching us on ITV Gold, how should they sort of get involved without getting in the way of the movement or the message to ensure that, exactly who we're talking about get accounted for and there's a conversation on that? How should we engage?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's really important right now as a community to figure out how we step up without centering ourselves in this moment. And I think that a lot of that is having those difficult conversations within our family. We've shared a lot of resources from other organizations that I mentioned earlier. I should also mention South Asians for Black Lives has put out a lot of different resources and ways to get involved. I think educating ourselves on what it really means when folks are talking about abolition, defunding the police, and not taxing our Black friends or Black community members to continue to explain things to us, but to really get out there and do some research on these really important conversations that are happening. And to do the work within our own family, within our religious institutions and our communities. I think these are the ways that we can not center ourselves, but be supportive of the conversation that is happening right now that should always continue to center Black communities.
Lakshmi, how important do you think the elections are going to play a role in right here to make sure that all minority communities are accounted for? We have somebody that we can rely on and somebody that can be advocated for. Currently, we're looking at primaries across the nation. We have elections coming in November. I know there's a lot that's that's been discussed in that sense. What are your comments on it?
Yeah, I do think the elections are important, but I think, voting is always, usually the very last step that we take, right, to select somebody to get into office. But there's so much organizing and building power in our communities that needs to happen before a ballot is cast. And so, unfortunately, I think between the two parties that we have in place right now, I don't necessarily think that we see a place for the kind of transformation that people are calling for right now. And so while I do think it's important to get out there and vote, and especially to push back against a lot of the efforts that are in place right now to repress the vote, to limit the possibilities for people to vote electronically and to vote by mail and absentee, those are the types of efforts that we need to be combating right now, because it is important that people exercise the right to vote. But I also do think that legislative change and elections are such a very minor part of the kind of change that we really need to see right now.
In terms of just SAALT, let's have a quick conversation about it, Lakshmi. What are you focused on for the next couple of weeks? There's so much happening in the country with COVID-19, with George Floyd, with the protests and the marches. Where is the SAALT focused on right now? And what are some of the major challenges that you have kind of faced in the last couple of weeks with COVID?
Yeah, I think, all of this, I think a lot of people have said, like, when we're already in a crisis, a lot of the longstanding inequities and injustices in our systems become even more exposed. And I think that's what we're seeing. We're in the context of COVID-19, but we're seeing the ramping up of state violence, both against Black communities, as it has always happened, and against the people who are protesting and calling attention to that. So I think the two are very much related. And those, for us, those are our top two priorities right now. And I know I've spoken a little bit about our work around, everything happening with police brutality. But with COVID-19 in particular, we have also created a resource page at SALT for people to, we understand as a national organization, we are not necessarily on the front lines, addressing the needs of our community members right now. So we've set up a resource page that allows people to both donate to the organizations that are on the front lines within South Asian communities in the places where our population is being hit the hardest. And so that we felt was really important. We continue to have monthly calls and webinars with our National Coalition of South Asian Organizations, where we can talk about both police brutality and violence, but also the longstanding additional inequities that our communities are facing and what we can do about that right now during the pandemic. And we're also going to be issuing a report on the impact of COVID-19 in South Asian communities, focused on areas that have been hit the hardest, but also areas that we just don't hear as much about, like the Central Valley of California, like the South, the Midwest, and other regions, and how they've really shifted to adapt to the needs of the community right now, and of course New York City, which has been hit the hardest. So those are some of the ways in which we're focusing our efforts in the next few weeks and months to come.
Do you have any comments on racial disparities seen throughout COVID-19 in this country?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think we continue to see the data that once again, Black communities have been hit the hardest by COVID-19 in terms of both infection rates, but also the access to healthcare and resources.
Yeah.
Even within the South Asian community, we continue to see that the same populations who are marginalized within our communities, Muslim, Sikh, working class, communities have been hit the hardest. And I think that continues to be the case. And once again, I think just continues to reinforce the systemic racism conversation we had earlier.
For sure. Well, Lakshmi, thank you so much for your time here on ITV Gold. I appreciate you for having that dialogue and also raising a lot of awareness and information. I would love for you to give a message out to the community on perhaps they can also join, SAALT and its efforts and help you get the word out even more.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you to all of you for listening. I encourage you to check out our website at SAALT.org and see the resources that we've collected there that really uplifts the work that's happening in our community at this time, and to reach out to us if you're interested in having more of a dialogue or being connected to those who are really having these important conversations in our communities. And thanks to everyone for listening.